Russian invasion of Ukraine was more than a wake-up call. It was a shock. There's a lot, if I could say, going on under the blanket. A big part of the world, not just China and India, which are by themselves a big part of the world, regard this as a European problem, a regional problem, or have some secret sympathy with the idea that a Western-led world order needs to adjust itself. As I talk to some American officials privately, obviously there's a debate, they're very worried. They think the war will go on at least another year or more.
Stephen, I've been following your writing and your work for a very long time, and it is great work. I mean, you, I believe, are based in Europe, and you're in the right place at the right time. One of the things you wrote about recently was because of the war in Ukraine, NATO is trying to remake itself back to what it was in the Cold War. What exactly are you seeing?
Well, there's a lot, if I could say, going on under the blanket, right? I mean, NATO is now 31 member states, including Finland. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine was more than a wake-up call. It was a shock. It was a psychological shock to the system. Even big NATO allies, the UK and US kept saying Russia would invade. France and Germany didn't want to hear about it. And even the Americans and the British thought it would end up quickly, that Ukraine would lose quickly. So this has all been a surprise. And for NATO, which, always insisted that it had no particular enemy in mind, it was obviously arranged to keep the Soviet Union at bay, to keep it from getting more of Europe than it got in the treaties after World War II. And then when the Soviet Union fell apart, when the Cold War ended, there was really a period of hope, misplaced perhaps, but certainly justifiable, that Russia could slowly be brought into being more of a partner and less of an enemy or an antagonist. And so the Russian invasion of Ukraine has just thrown that right out the window. So NATO, once again, is trying to become that alliance that can protect its own citizens from Russian aggression, and doing that by increasing its deterrence. Now, that means putting more troops on Russian borders, spending more money, et cetera, et cetera. We can go into it, but it's really a big change.
So I think reading your piece, you mentioned that previously it was deterrence by retaliation, but this new focus is deterrence by denial. And you just mentioned a little bit about that, talking about more troops on Russia's borders. Based on your reporting, what else have you learned about how they plan to build this out?
I mean, just to, fill out the explanation, when they thought Russia wasn't really much of a problem, right? They thought, well, they'll have deterrence, but if something happened, American troops could get there eventually and could solve the problem. Even after 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, which was something of a shock, NATO began to change and to spend more money, and it started putting small battalion-sized groups in the 4 Baltic countries and Poland, right? So the 3 Baltic states and Poland, who felt most at risk, and they'd never really had, they didn't call them permanent stationing. They were rotating, because under a previous NATO-Russia agreement, when everybody thought Russia was not going to be as aggressive, there were limits, promises made of not putting NATO troops next to Russia. That's all out the window. So they've now, since a year, since the invasion, they've built 4 more battalion-sized forces south along the border. So now there are 8 of them all along these so-called frontier states. But there are only about 10,000 troops total. So the idea is to build those out to larger forces, basically brigade-sized forces, which are 4,000 to 5,000 troops in each country. Now, some will circulate, but the idea is to have many more troops, to have a much bigger kind of goat tethered to the stake, and enough troops so that if Russia should try to invade, the point would be to deter by denying Russia real territory, not waiting for the Americans. And one of the main reasons this has been happening is that the countries along the Russian border have seen what happened in Ukraine. They've seen what happened in Bucha, in Irpin, in Mariupol. They've seen the way Russian troops have behaved, and they do not want to have several months of Russian occupation themselves until the Americans and others can come to the rescue. That's the big difference.
Yeah. Steve, do you see from what NATO is doing any reaction, or at least what NATO is planning to do and what they've done so far? Do you see any response from Russia at this point? Or is Russia even in a position to respond based on the fact that it's in a war with Ukraine that it's in many ways losing?
That's a very right thing to say. Russia has rhetorically responded, certainly to the new battalions in places like Romania, Slovakia, Bulgaria. They have responded angrily to Finland joining NATO, which it did very recently. It has argued that, Sweden shouldn't join and that it will respond. Now, how will it respond? Now, it has, because Russia's still a nuclear power, and it has submarines, and it has a navy, and it has lots of capacities that are not being used in Ukraine. So people need to take it very seriously. But so far, their talk of building up troops along, let's say, the Finnish border, they don't have them. They're all in Ukraine. So for now, it's not really a problem. And, even if they talk about, extra nuclear missiles aimed at NATO's already covered by Russian nuclear missiles. I mean, even if they have more of them, it really makes very, very little strategic difference.
Does Russia have any plan? Do you see them actually planning to follow through on these many threats that we've seen from Medvedev, and some from Putin, and some from the military, to use tactical nuclear weapons? Do you get the sense that they are serious about that?
It's very easy to be wrong because you can't get inside Putin's head, really. I mean, I thought we used to be able to, but not anymore. No, I don't think they're serious about using tactical nuclear weapons. Certainly, they don't want to get into a fight with NATO itself, right? I mean, nor does NATO want to get into a fight with Russia, which is one of the reasons President Biden has been so careful not to get American troops involved, why there's no no-fly zone over Ukraine. They don't want any chance of a NATO-Russian confrontation. Russians don't want that either. So no, I don't see that as realistic. The only thing, I talk to people who worry about this, think that if Russia really is in danger of a collapse, if suddenly its troops flee, if Crimea is at risk, if particularly the Black Sea port of Sevastopol on Crimea is at risk, and that's a big thing for the Russian Navy's control over the Black Sea, if it looks like Russia's collapsing, then perhaps Putin might use a tactical nuclear weapon. But there are no plans that I've heard of, and I don't think the Russians are serious about it.
So, one of the stated objectives of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and the government as a whole is to get all of Ukraine back to its pre-2014 borders. And that would include Crimea, and, other areas. So that is something that Ukraine's pushing for. So is there a likelihood that Ukraine would see what you were just saying, that there's a possibility Russia would use nuclear weapons if you did such and such, if you did X, that they would change their plans? Or are they in this and going to go forward based on what we've heard them say?
It's really hard to know. I think for them to get that far, to be able to take back Crimea, it's not going to happen soon if it happens at all. But look, I'm not on the ground there, but the Russians have set up pretty strong defensive positions. The Ukrainians are planning this big counteroffensive for late this spring or even early summer. And I think we just have to wait to see the results of that offensive and hold off judgment to see where Russian lines end up, where Ukrainian lines end up. Now, certainly legally, internationally, Ukraine's sovereign borders include Crimea, and they include the Donbass. Even China, which is supporting Russia, sort of, recognizes Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. But there are lots of conflicts that freeze. Look at Cyprus, look at South Korea, which has been frozen since 1950, whatever it is. And the fear is that might happen with Ukraine. But hard to know. I mean, the Ukrainians are right to say we want all our sovereign territory back. And, the American position is we're going to try to help them, give them whatever they need. But I think as I talk to some American officials privately, obviously there's a debate, they're very worried. Well, first of all, they're skeptical, which is some of what these leaks showed, that Ukraine will make huge progress even in this counteroffensive. They think the war will go on at least another year or more. And there is a kind of quiet nervousness about ambitions to try to take Crimea. So nobody really knows, but that's my sense of sort of where the current conversation is. Let's put it that way.
Finally, I'd like to ask you, from your perch there, what is it that's happening that we're not talking about or we don't see over here, or just anywhere that isn't where you are, and in basically the conversations that you're having with the people you're talking with and the reporting that you're doing? What is it that's happening that we should be aware of, we should know about, and should be paying attention to?
Well, there are a few things. I mean, one I'm sure you've dealt with, which is just that a big part of the world, not just China and India, which are by themselves a big part of the world, regard this as a European problem, a regional problem, or have some secret sympathy with the idea that a Western-led world order needs to adjust itself in a world where Asia is getting more powerful, where Africa is getting more rich, where the balance of power just isn't the same as it was at the end of World War II. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, I think, is less happy, which is that there's still a lot of work in Ukraine to do to make sure that everything gets where it's supposed to be going, that there isn't corruption. It's fighting bravely, God knows, but I don't see Russia giving up. And so at some point, I think, as we all know, conflicts end either in stalemate or in negotiations or in total victory. I don't think the last one's going to happen. But this confidence that Ukraine has, that Zelensky has, that the war will turn quickly, I think we need to be very careful about that. And politically, for him, it's very difficult because anything less than driving Russians out will be politically dangerous for him. So there's those things. And the last thing I would say is there's just nervousness, particularly in political Europe as the war goes on, how long it will go on, how much it will end up costing, where it will end up, what happens to prices, what happens to food prices. There's a bit of a worry politically that the populist right wing will do well because of these anxieties, and that more Europeans will see this kind of as an American-Russian war and less a war for their own security. Those are my concerns.
Stephen, thank you very much. Stephen Erlanger is the diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times based in Brussels. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you very much.